I would like to look into the book of Job. And this is one of my favorite books in the Bible that I'm often drawn to when wanting to sometimes trying to study some new thing or refresh on something. Oftentimes I find myself coming back to Job, and there's so much that can be learned from this book, and I have a long-term goal of preaching through the entire book, chapter by chapter. I'm not there yet, but I would like to. Really, I want to look at one chapter in the book of Job today, but we're gonna kind of jump through some different things. All right. So first off, let's look at Job chapter 1. And we're going to end up in Job 42 is where I'm going to end up, which is the last chapter. But let's give an overview on where we are or where Job is. All right. Here we go. Job chapter 1, verse number 1. Job chapter 1, verse number 1. Here we find that we're introduced to this man called Job. All right. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So immediately we recognize that Job is not your average quote, I'll say Christian. Obviously he's in the Old Testament, so he's not a Christian. But he's certainly a believer in God. That he was, it says he was upright. He was perfect and upright, right? That means he lived a fully mature, godly life, that he sought to do right, that in every decision he makes, he wanted to do the right thing. If the book of Job was a TV show, he would be the protagonist who is always trying to do the right thing, right? And so Job, he was perfect and upright. He feared God, right? And so he's a believer in God. He sought to please God and do everything. He was a rightly religious man. And notice it says he eschewed evil. That word eschewed means to avoid or to stay away from. And so not only was he a man who sought to live right and be right and do the right thing, not only was he a rightly religious man who believed in God and sought to do everything God wanted him to do, but he also avoided evil, right? I think too often Christians have the reputation of being hypocrites, of saying they want to do the right thing and projecting religiosity, but when it comes to avoiding evil, some of us don't, and we participate in the evil. And so that label of hypocrite often rightly is attached to us as Christians, but not so with the book with Job's character here, though he would be accused of this later. All right, so we have Job. Notice verse 2 and 3. Verse 2 and 3 says, and there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. All right. So here we see that on top of Job being a righteous man who sought to fear God and avoid doing evil things and intently doing good things, but he was very, very wealthy. He had a big family. He had lots of financial means, certainly of that day, raising cattle and sheep and all these things that they had. And then a very great household. So he had to have workers and servants to help manage the whole thing. And so it was a great big operation. Notice this phrase, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East, right? So he wasn't just a wealthy man. He was the wealthy man. He was the guy, right? He was the Jeff Bezos of his era. He was the guy that everyone looked to as, oh, who's the most wealthy? Oh yeah, that's Job. Who's the guy who's got the best of everything? Oh, that's Job. I imagine if Job had access to rocket fuel, that he would have built a ship to go to outer space. I don't know. That seems to be a thing rich people do. But so here he is, the greatest of all the men of the East. And so we see Job being a good man, being the greatest. His character was great. He's a religious man, sought to follow God. And notice that he's a religious man. We see an example of that in verses 4 and 5, where he's offering sacrifices, burnt offerings. You see this in verse 5. He's offering burnt offerings for his children, right? And so he's and so the timing, like when the book of Job itself is considered to be the oldest book of the Bible as far as when it was written, and partly because of the events that are happening here is Job is the one in the place of a priest offering these sacrifices. And so as a believer in God, the Jewish people in the Old Testament would offer these sacrifices either through the tabernacle with the priest or through the temple with the priest at the temple, depending on which time period we're in the Old Testament. But we see Job here not going to a tabernacle or a temple, but performing that office of the priest himself, which indicates that the events of the book of Job is occurring before the tabernacle and the temple were put in place. And so Job is in that position, and he's offering those sacrifices for his family. All right. Now something interesting happens. It says in verse number 6, it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan come among them. So there's a lot in the book of Job that we could focus on and dwell on, and I'm just going to lightly touch on some things, but certainly they deserve a more further analysis, but that is for another time. But here we have these beings, these sons of God, which later in the book of Job we find that these sons of God are angels, are coming to present themselves before the Lord, before God himself. And so they have this thing where they have to come and go before God. But now Satan is coming among them. And of course, we know that Satan started as an angel in heaven. But so now he has an access to God and to bring a report to God Almighty. And so look at verse 7. It says, and the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? It's like in court when it's a very good rule of thumb for lawyers that you don't ask a question that you don't know the answer to. And certainly God knows the answer to this, right? He says, whence comest thou? He says, then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down in it. All right. So the Lord does a peculiar thing here. He says, he brings up Job to Satan. He says, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. See, so not only did Job have a good reputation among men, but he had a right and a good reputation with God himself, which I would argue, and it's not even an argument, that is the best place for our reputation to be held. We shouldn't worry about what our reputation is among men as much as what our reputation is with God. But here we have God bringing up Job to Satan. And so he decides to allow Satan to test Job, to put Job through a trial. And We'll look down at here, verse number 12. So the Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he has is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. All right. So God allows Satan to test Job, to try Job, and so the first testing goes through, and we see this starting in verse 13. And what happens is Satan attacks. Here we see Satan attacking, verse number 13. And then, all right, so all his sons and daughters, all his kids are eating together. They're having a party. They're just having a time together. And then the enemy attacks. We see this in verse 15. The Sabians fell upon them, took them away. They've slain the servants at the edges of the sword, and I only escaped to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up thy sheep, and the servants are consumed with them, and I am only escaped to tell thee. Verse 17. While he was yet speaking, there came another. It said the Chaldeans and made out with 3 bands and fell upon your camels and carried them away, and I'm the only one escaped to tell thee. Probably the worst thing here. Verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell me. Job going through a terrible time. I mean, the amount of loss that Job faced in one day is literally unfathomable. In the United States, in the 1920s, there was a crash of the financial system, which turned into an era called the Great Depression. But when that crash happened, people lost millions and millions of dollars, lost their savings, lost everything, and that was just financial loss. And there's stories of people jumping out of buildings and committing suicide because of the loss of just their finances. Here we have in Job not only losing his finances, but losing his children. It's bad enough that these different bands and groups of marauders come in and stealing their sheep and stealing his wealth. You know, as a father, I can deal with that. But then this to Job's point of view, some random event of this tornado coming through, this giant wind coming through, knocking down his house and killing his children. Unfathomable grief that must have caused Job. I am often amazed at Job's reaction in this day, in this moment of grief. We see this in verse number 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. Job's first reaction upon hearing the loss of his children, and I place that above the loss of his wealth. His first reaction was to worship God. Boy, that's tough. That's tough. I can't fathom that. I could only pray that would be my reaction if I found out that I lost all my wealth, which isn't very much, but if I lost all my kids in one big accident, I would. What a great example Job is here. He said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is Job's mindset in his moment of grief. So the testing happens. All right. Now, chapter 2 comes. You'd think that would be enough. So again, these sons of God, these angels, come to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, who was once an angel, coming to present themselves before the Lord again. Right. And so the Lord has this conversation with Satan again. And at this point, maybe God's he's like, hey, have you seen what my servant Job has done? This is kind of my paraphrase of this, right? It says this, look at verse 3. And he still holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. He still held his integrity. So then Satan's like, oh yeah? Well, you could take all that a man has, but touch his health, let him get sick, and let's see how well he does. And so verse 6, and the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. All right. So now Satan touches Job in verse 7, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. Now, I am not an expert on boils, but my dad suffered with them for a little while, a few years back, and he would have one or two at a time, and he would describe to me the absolute pain just one boil was to him, like almost debilitating, almost. And imagining that amount of pain, not just in one area, but all over, right? From the bottom of your foot to the top of your head, everywhere. Absolute pain and misery he is in. So here we are. Job is attacked by Satan. Job loses his wealth. Job's children are killed. Now he's got this very painful disease, and he's literally going from the greatest man of the East to being considered the dreg of society, the person that you would walk past. You know, how many of us have walked down Cuba Street as you're going to one of the shops or going through something, and then you have a number of homeless people there on the sides of the street, and how often we want to walk past those. We don't want to look at people who are in those bad situations. So Job went from that highest penthouse to that homeless person who lost everything and is in a very, very bad place. So he went to that place where most everybody is highly respected, and now he's in a place where people are putting their nose down there and looking down at them. By the way, let me say that did you know that Jesus not only died for those in the penthouse, but he died for those homeless people as well? We should look to be a witness to those people as well, because Jesus died for all. You know, there's a one of my favorite songs says the drunk on the street, the rich in their palaces, the poor and unlearned, and the man of degree, they all have a soul in need of salvation. And man, that is absolute truth. So Job is in a bad place. He's in a bad place. His meteoric fall to where he is, lost everything. So let's look at. All right, let's look at Job chapter 2, verse number 11. All right, so here we have. So Job has some friends, and let's look at verse 11. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And so these, I think I believe these guys, these friends of Job, came with very good intentions when they heard of Job's fall and in the state that he is, and they came to visit with him. Right, and verse number 12 talks about when they saw him from afar, they didn't even know him, but when they recognized that was him, they wept. They wept and they were in mourning because they realized the fall of their good friend. Look at verse 13. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was great. If you've ever sat with somebody who's gone through a hard time or gone through grief or great loss, sometimes there's nothing you can say. And oftentimes I find myself at a loss for words or what I can say to be a help to people. But I've found that sometimes the greatest help you can be is just being there and listening, just to be there for them, just sit there, even if you're just sitting there in silence. Sometimes the greatest thing that can be said is nothing. And so here we have Job and his friends just kind of sitting around. They came to be with him, right? And so here they are, sat around with them to be with him. All right. So what follows now? What follows in the book of Job is a series of discussions between Job and his friends, and so Job's friends would all three of these guys will come to the conclusion that Job's condition, the reason why he lost his wealth, the reason why he lost his children, the reason why his health is failing, that the reason God's hand is seemingly off of Job is because Job must have done something wicked. He must be a hypocrite of some point. He must that these things are happening because of Job's own failings and hidden sins. And so Eliphaz speaks for 4 chapters. Bildad will speak for 3 of the chapters. Zophar speaks for 2 chapters. And Job will respond. In fact, Job spends a great deal of time defending himself against these accusations. In fact, there are twice as many chapters of Job defending himself as there is of Job being accused. And so this back and forth continues. Now, there is an interesting kind of an interlude within the book of Job, considering the person of Elihu. And he's not mentioned as one of Job's friends in the beginning. And at the end of the book, when God is dealing out his punishment or what he wants his 3 friends to do, Elihu's not mentioned among them. And in fact, Elihu actually speaks more as far as chapter-wise than any of the others. He speaks for 32 through 37, 5-6 chapters. So, but we're not going to be spending time on Elihu today. That deserves its own separate discussion. But I do want to mention it here because if you read through the book of Job, you're going to come across Elihu, and he says this piece and he's gone, and it's almost like he wasn't there. But most of the focus of the book of Job is on Job himself and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So Job defends himself over and over and over again, kind of long-winded speeches spelling out, his point of view, right? And I find this fascinating, a fascinating look on dealing with people and grief. That it was an interesting tact for Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar to come to Job with the right intentions and to sit there and not say anything for a week, just being with them. I think it's a right first step. But then go into the place where, now, Job, we know this is happening to you because you've been such a bad person. That's probably not the kind of advice you want to be hearing from your friends. But so this happens, this occurs, and at some point in the future, we'll get into those arguments. But near the end of the book, God shows up, right? And he addresses Job, and he admonishes Job. And then Job has this back and forth with God himself. And so in chapter 42, as I said, we get there. In chapter 42, Job finally comes to some right conclusions about God, though I believe it took him a while to get there. And Lord willing, in the future, we'll look at his journey to get to that place. And of all Job's long-winded speeches and passionate defenses of himself, I believe it wasn't until chapter 42 that Job finally understood. And so I'd like to bring this message, and that was all the introduction. And Lord willing, we'll probably finish this message next week. But the title of this message is The Right Conclusions of Job About God. The right conclusions of Job about God. Let's look at chapter 42. Job chapter 42. All right. And let's start reading. It says, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. All right. Notice the first answer that Job makes to the Lord, right? The first thing that Job does. And notice that, number one, this is Job's reverence for God's omnipotence and omniscience. Job's reverence for God's omnipotence and omniscience. He says, I know that thou canst do everything. He says, God, I know that you are a God that can do anything. You can do everything. You're a God that you are the God. You are all powerful God. Revelation chapter 19:6 says this, And I heard as it were the voice of a great multitude, and the voice of many waters, and as the voice of mighty thundering, saying, Alleluia, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. That omnipotence, that means all powerful. Job is recognizing that God, I know you can do everything. He says, I know it. I know thou can't do everything. You are a God that created the heavens. You are the God that created this universe. The power that you have surpasses all other known forms. You are an all-powerful God. You are in the beginning. You are the ending. You are the Alpha. You are the Omega. You are omnipotent. And Job starts with this reverence for God, that He is all-powerful. He is an all-powerful God. Look back at our verse. It says, I know that thou canst do everything. And notice the second part, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. So not only is God omnipotent and all-powerful, but He is all-knowing. No thought can be withholden from thee. He is omniscient. He knows everything. Psalm 147, verse number 5 says, Great is our Lord and of great power, omnipotent. His understanding is infinite. Not only does this all-powerful God have the power to create everything, but his understanding is infinite. He is omniscient. He knows everything. There's nothing that God does not know. There's no thought that we can think that God does not recognize. Job's reverence and understanding of who God is, he is reverently portraying this in his opening remarks in chapter 42. I know thou canst do everything, and I know no thought can be withholden from thee. Job's reverence for God. Now let's look at Number two, I want you to notice Job's recognition of what he did not fully grasp about God. Job's recognition about what he did not fully grasp about God. Look at verse 3. All right. Job continuing his answer to the Lord. He says this, who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Now it's interesting here because at this point, Job is responding to questions, almost rhetorical questions that God had asked Job, right? So let's look back. I'll show you what I mean. Chapter 38. Chapter 38. There it is. Says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. So here's after the speeches, the long-winded speeches, and the defenses of Job, and after Elihu says his piece, said then the Lord shows up to Job, and he's speaking directly to Job, and God says to Job this, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Right? So God is asking Job this question. Now let's go back to 42 and look at Job saying, so he's repeating God's question, like he's restating it. He says, who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? And then he answers it. He says, it's me, right? So let's look at, all right. So God's accusation, he's asking, who is this person? Who is he that hideth counsel? Who do you think you are? And this is, well, let's go back to chapter 38 and we'll look at God's response to this. We'll look at verses, what verse we look at? We'll look at verses, all right, we're going to look at a chapter, all right, look at this, verse 2. All right, so here's God's question to Job. And it is more of a statement, right? He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? He says, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Now look at this. This is God speaking to Job. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And the sons of God were there at creation. Or who hath shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place and set bars and doors. And said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. God makes a unanswerable accusation about his unlimited power, comparing himself to man. And he lays out this charge, right? That Job, who do you think you are? You're nothing. Where were you when I created this earth? Where were you when I made the waters go this way and that way? Where were you? He lays out the charge that Job is unqualified to even question God. He lays out in detail many of the things that the power of God has created. These are things that man cannot do, that things that Job cannot do. This contrast of the levels of power between God and man, between the infinite and the finite, between God and between Job. So we have God's accusation. Then we see Job's So Job restates it, right? God, in fact, he goes on for a couple chapters listing all these things. Job's like, who is this that hideth counsel without knowledge? Who is that? Uh, you know, in Job's God's accusation against this hiding counsel without knowledge, and Job's attempted defense of himself kind of revealed that his explanations were making this whole subject of who God is maybe less understandable, right? He's darkening it without knowledge. And so Job's answer in chapter 42. So he restates what God said after this rhetorical, unanswerable accusation by God. He says, therefore, here's Job's answer. He says, therefore, you know what? I understood not the things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. He says, I didn't know what I was talking about. It's like that's, and in fact, that's a very wise conclusion to come through. And in fact, it's okay to say that you don't know. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's going. You're right. It's like you're right. What can I answer? Right? He recognizes that God says, who is this? Who is doing this? Job's like, yeah, you're right. It's me. He says, I am the man that does not fully comprehend. I am the man that does not fully grasp this. And then, by the way, this is a stark admission, I think, of humility that Job, this most righteous person in man's eyes and even in God's eyes, the most put together believer of his time, that he had to come to this place of humility. So let's look at Job 29, just for an example of some of the arguments that Job was making for himself. Look at verse number 8. So this is Job speaking to an impassioned defense of his friends accusing him. He says, when I went out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the aged arose and stood up. The princes refrained talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The nobles held their peace, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. He said, right? Job is saying when he went out, like people paid him reverence. People were like awed by his presence. Right? Verse 11, when the ear heard me, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. Here's Job. Look at what Job says. Job's defense of himself. He says, because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. He says, I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem. He says, I was to the blind. I was eyes to the blind, and feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not, I searched out. And I break the jaws of the wicked and plucked the spoil out of his teeth. Now, it's certainly probable that what Job is saying was true. But Job's defense of himself certainly comes across as slightly self-righteous. And so we contrast that with Job's response, with his impassioned lining out the things that he was doing that was right, with his answer to God, his recognition that, you know what, doesn't matter what I did. I didn't understand what was happening. This God, you are so infinite. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 33 says this: the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. The humility should be a mark of a Christian. It shouldn't, we as Christians shouldn't be going around lifting ourselves up, exalting ourselves, but humility should be the mark of a Christian. I notice Job sets aside his own ego. He recognizes his own failings to lift that up of God. his answer, he says, who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? He says, it was me. You know what? You're right, God. I have not fully understood what was happening here. In the book of John, chapter 3, we have a tremendous scripture. The John the Baptist, when approached about who was this Jesus to Christ, and he came to the conclusion, he must increase, but I must decrease. That this Jesus Christ, who is God in the flesh, who is that Son of God, who is going to die on the cross for us, he must be increased, and me, this lowly, finite man, must decrease. And I think Job has come to this conclusion. Job came to this conclusion that who is this that darkeneth counsel? It was me. I don't know. It was me. It was me. I am the problem, right? I must decrease. We must increase the infinite God. Job's right conclusions about God. We see his reverence for God's omnipotence and omniscience. We see Job's recognition of what he fully did not grasp about God. That, you know what, that God must increase, I must decrease. It is all about God. And Lord willing, next week we'll wrap up this message either right here on our Facebook page or Lord willing in person. We'll look at the final 2 points of what Job's right conclusions mean.